All right, Alexander, let's talk about the situation in Ukraine. And I guess we have to do kind of two videos in one, it seems, because we have the one situation in Kursk, which we have to discuss, and then we have everything that's unfolding in Donbass. I know there's important news about the fall of New York, Torret, Pakros. A lot of important areas are now falling to the Russian military or are about to fall to the Russian military. But you have this Kursk situation, which is taking all of the media attention away from the important part of the conflict, which is in the Donbass. So I don't know, which one do you want to start off with first?
I'm going to suggest that we actually do look at the general military situation first, and maybe we can touch Kursk into it and then home in a little bit more precisely, because what Ukraine did is that even though they are massively overextended and short of men and machines to fight across what is a very extended front line, and even though the Russians have been building up their forces steadily over the course of the year, they did something that is militarily completely illogical, which is that they extended their front line further. They stretched themselves out even more. And they did that through this Kursk incursion. And they sent 10,000 troops apparently into Kursk region. There's reports that there's another 10,000 troops somewhere, in reserve, that they're apparently being heavily bombed and attacked by the Russians at this particular time. So that's 20,000 men. It's a significant proportion of the Ukrainian army. And it's not just in terms of numbers. I mean, the Ukrainian army is believed to number, its frontline strength is believed to be around between 250 and 300,000. So you get a sense of, it's a significant block of troops. But it's also some of their very best troops. Some of their most elite units have been sent to Kursk. And not just that, but a very large proportion of their armour has been sent to Kursk as well. And their artillery is there. Their HIMARS missiles were in the area, the HIMARS launchers. A lot of their best equipment, all concentrated in this one place. And apparently this front, this rather small front in Kursk, is now getting all the best supplies. So we're getting reports from all sorts of places, Ukrainian soldiers in places like Pakros, Torret, they're all complaining that they're not getting reinforcements, they're not getting supplies, they're being heavily outnumbered by the Russians. And the result is that all across the contact line now, the Russians are breaking through. And in fact, the advance is accelerating. Now, this brings us back to this big question of why have the Ukrainians done this thing to themselves? Because if you look at the Kursk situation at the present time, despite, concentrating this large force in Kursk, and crossing the border, so far, all that they've actually managed to achieve in Kursk region is occupy a number of villages. And, people talk about 80 villages, but some of these are tiny places. I mean, we're talking about places that you won't find on any map. They are very, very small, a couple of dozen people. So they've occupied about 80 villages, as I said, some of them tiny, large stretches of forest, which have no economic use, and one small town, Suja, of which perhaps they control all of it. The Russians say that they still control some of the eastern bits of Suja. The Ukrainians are trying to persuade us that they control all of it, and they're sending Western journalists to Suja to try to confirm that story. But they don't seem to be able, or at least they haven't managed for the moment, to expand beyond this belt of very uninteresting territory that they control inside Russia. And they're giving contradictory or rather different explanations all the time about what they're doing. So when it first began, Zelensky's advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, said that this was all done in order to improve Ukraine's position in forthcoming negotiations. That was what he said. Then a couple of day or so afterwards, the narrative shifted. It was to try to get the Russians to divert their forces from the rest of the front line in Donbass. And then we've had another explanation now from Zelensky himself. It's all about creating a buffer zone on Russian territory. So you see different explanations, which lead me to think that, again, the Ukrainians are not being honest about what they were really trying to do. But let's go through those explanations one by one. The first explanation, it was supposed to put Ukraine in a better position in negotiations. As could have been predicted, and as we said on the Duran, what this operation has actually done is that it's made the Russians decide that no negotiations with Ukraine are possible at all. So the Russians are rejecting negotiations. So it hasn't put Ukraine in a better position with respect to negotiations. It's meant that Ukraine isn't getting any kind of negotiations. And you could see that. You could see this from the Chinese. There's been more articles today in Global Times saying straightforwardly that now negotiations are impossible. The second, that it was intended to get the Russians to divert forces from Donbass. Well, it's now clear that's not happening. The Russians are continuing to keep all their forces in Donbass, and they remain on the offensive. The third explanation, to create a buffer zone, is ridiculous. How do you create a buffer zone like this inside Russia? What the Ukrainians are doing is that they're committing more and more men and more of their machines. They're suffering heavier and heavier losses, trying to hold useless ground in Russia, even as their forces get depleted. If they wanted to create a proper barrier to the Russians, who, remember, outnumber them in northern Ukraine, far more logical thing to have done would have been to set up proper fortified lines, create something somehow somewhat analogous to the Surovikin line that the Russians created. A buffer zone of the sort that the Ukrainians are talking about makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. You're talking about preventing Russian artillery strikes on Ukrainian cities like Sumy. The Russians are bombing them. Their air force is completely unaffected by what the Ukrainians are doing on the ground. So none of that makes any sense. I come back to what I consider to have been the actual explanation, one that the Russians have been talking about a lot. The Western media touched on it. Now they walked away from it. I am absolutely sure the original plan was to capture Kurchatov and the nuclear power station. It's the only thing that makes any kind of sense in terms of this operation. They'd captured the power station. They would have been able to create a crisis in Russia. Perhaps the Russians might have negotiated. Who's to say what might have happened? It didn't happen. So they're now coming up with explanations to explain what they're doing in Kursk, because for prestige reasons, they can't retreat. And in the meantime, their front lines everywhere else are collapsing. And that, I think, is the basic story about what is going on. Now, we can go into more details. We can discuss the situation in Kursk. I don't think we need to, actually, because not very much is really happening in Kursk. They're knocking out the old bridge in various places, and this is getting a lot of news, but it's not improving their overall tactical situation. Looking at what's happening in other places, that is big news, And of course, for the moment, the media in the West is only gently touching it. But I mean, it's clear that a major operational crisis is emerging.
Yeah, just real quick to finish our conversation on Kursk, because I agree, I don't think there's really much to discuss. We've been discussing it a lot. You've been discussing it on your channel a lot. I've been discussing it on my channel a lot. The Duran, we've been discussing it as well. But really what we have, I mean, maybe I'm looking at it from a very simple viewpoint, but they didn't capture the power plant. The collective West cannot come out and say this was all about capturing a nuclear power plant or threatening the destruction of a nuclear power plant in exchange for something from Russia, because obviously that would look horrible for the world if the collective West came out and said that. So they have to create a Ghost of Kiev, Kherson counteroffensive, Kharkov counteroffensive, Snake Island narrative.
Yes.
Now, and that's what they're wrestling with to try and create. It's an information war, but a narrative which is analogous to the Kherson counteroffensive, so they can spin this as a victory. I mean, what do you think about that?
You're absolutely right. That's exactly what it's become. You provided both the reason why they can't admit to the reality, which is, as you correctly say, admitting that the objective was to seize the nuclear power plant is impossible. I mean, it would create massive alarm bells across the West, amongst Western public as well. So they can't say that, and they can't also admit that the operation has failed. I mean, if they captured the power plant, it would have been different. You could have created a different narrative, but
they could have spun a different.
They could have spun it differently. But given that the power plant wasn't captured, and now it's almost certain that it isn't going to be captured, they have to do exactly what you said. They have to come up with various narratives to explain why the Ukrainians are still in Kursk and why they're prepared to stay there and suffer all these enormous losses. Now, of course, it's a narrative game, an information war game, which is killing them because they're suffering terrible losses there. This isn't like, it's like the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives all over again. But at least in those offensives, there were military objectives which were, to a certain extent, achieved. There is nothing being achieved here. All that is being achieved is that Ukraine's last best reserves are being destroyed. They are being sacrificed to achieve an information purpose, even as the front lines everywhere else collapse.
Yeah, agreed. And it's going bad for them when The Guardian, the New York Times, The Economist, NBC News, they're all running with a title which says something along the lines of the Kursk operation was a gamble or was a high-risk gamble. They're all saying that, which points to this thing turning out very bad for Ukraine. They just can't say it. So they're using words like this is very risky or high risk or gamble. They're basically saying that this is going to be a disaster. When they say this is a gamble, they mean this is going to turn out to be a disaster.
Correct.
Yeah. So that brings us to why this is going to be a disaster. And the reason this is going to be a disaster is because, as you said, they've diverted so much to Kursk, and it's accelerated the collapse of New York. Yeah. I think New York now is fully in control of the Russian military. I think we haven't gotten an official confirmation from the Ministry of Defense, but Ukrainian channels are saying that New York is gone. Russia's captured it. Pakros, Torret. We're talking about very fortified areas. And even Kupiansk, even the Kupiansk direction, it looks like the Russians are advancing. Yes. So this is a catastrophe, not because of Kursk. The catastrophe that Ukraine is suffering in Kursk, yes, is a catastrophe for the Ukraine military, but it's a double catastrophe because they're now suffering in the Donbass.
Absolutely. Now, to say this very clearly, the Russians would have got to all of these places eventually anyway. I mean, what Kursk has done is that it has greatly accelerated this process, probably by 1 or 2 months, I'm guessing. I don't think that's an understatement. If all those forces that have been sent to Kursk had been sent to defend Torret, for example, or perhaps even more importantly, Pakros and the area around Pakros, then of course the situation would have been very, very markedly slowed down and the Ukrainians would have achieved something. But they didn't do that. And the result is that all of these key places are now in danger of collapse. Now, we're talking about substantial places. Pakrovsk and the area around it. Pakrovsk itself has a population of around 60,000. If you're looking at the larger Pakrovsk conurbation, you're talking about 100,000 people, thereabouts. Apparently, defences are very disorganised around Pakrovsk. The Russians have made enormous progress. They're now literally, 2 or 3 kilometres in places from Mirnograd, some say about 5 kilometres from Pakrovsk itself. Pakrovsk is the biggest single, most important supply and logistical hub of the Ukrainian army in the whole of Donbass, and it's now at risk and quite possibly and plausibly will fall. And, there are also smaller logistical hubs nearby, Selidovo being one. The Russians are apparently 2 kilometers also from Selidovo. There are some positions around Selidovo. There's some coal mines, apparently, which some people rather optimistically think the Ukrainians might be able to organize defenses around. It's probably very late in the day because Pakrovsk was well to the rear. It was not apparently especially well fortified. There's no sign, for example, that there's dense minefields being created around it or anything like that. But if Pakrovsk falls, the entire supply situation for Ukraine begins to collapse across the entire Donbass. The main supply road from Dnipro, which is, the big city, the big industrial city on the Dnieper River, is cut, and Ukrainian forces start to face a massive operational crisis. Now, bear in mind, the Russians can cut the roads east of Pakrovsk as well. They don't need to take Pakrovsk to cut the highway. They're very, very close to the highway in all sorts of places. But if they take Pakrovsk, then they won't just cut the highway, but they could potentially continue advancing westwards, all the way first to another city called Pavlograd, which is absolutely not defended, and then beyond that to the Dnieper River itself. And then, we've discussed in many programs how if the Russians reach the Dnieper in central Ukraine, close to Dnipro and Zaporozhye, and if they move along this road, they will be literally opposite Dnipro. Well, then it's essentially game over. I mean, the entire supply situation will collapse. That's Pakrovsk. And as I said, they're literally almost there. They were, about 20 kilometers from Pakrovsk when the Kursk operation started. Now they're almost, outside it. I mean, because all sorts of important villages and fortified positions which Ukraine was trying to defend have collapsed because the men there aren't getting reinforcements. And elsewhere, there is this other big fortified town called Torret. Now, Torret is very like Avdiivka. You remember Avdiivka was this big this fortress close to Donetsk. Torret was a fortress that Ukraine created close to another Russian-controlled town in Donbass, which is Gorlovka, which is another place which rebelled and broke away from the Ukrainians in 2014. So the Ukrainians created this massive fortified position near Gorlovka. So Torretsk itself, very heavily fortified. Niu-York, it's more than just a village, it's a sort of suburb of Torretsk. One of the most heavily fortified positions that Ukraine created anywhere in Donbass. And the whole thing's collapsing. As you rightly said, Niu-York almost certainly has now been captured. We've not yet had official confirmation of this, but the Ukrainians are admitting to the fact that Niu-York has collapsed. All the other places around Torret collapsed as well. The other sort of fortified villages, which are, the first sort of wall around Torretsk, they've all collapsed. Reports that the Russians are now well inside Torretsk itself. It looks as if within a few days, weeks, I'm not going to try and guess how long, the Russians will capture Torretsk, one of the most heavily fortified positions. And just as happened when Avdiivka fell, there are no fortified positions that the Ukrainians have beyond Torret. The Russians can go driving all the way up, first to an important town called Konstantinovka, which is another significant supply hub, not as important as Pakros. What happens is the supplies go through Pakros, up the main road to Konstantinovka. The Ukrainians lose both Pakros and Konstantinovka. Their whole supply situation essentially collapses across Donbass. So the Russians can move all the way up to Konstantinovka. Beyond Konstantinovka are Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. If Konstantinovka is lost, the Ukrainians won't be able to hold on to those two remaining towns, and the Battle of Donbass and of eastern Ukraine, by the way, will be over. And we're getting all kinds of other news, perhaps not quite as important as what's going on in Torretsk as well, but there's a small river to the west of Slavyansk called the Zherebets River. It's now confirmed that the Russians have crossed it. The Ukrainians have provided film showing Russian troops operating east of the Zherebets River. Kupiansk, as you said correctly, the situation there is turning out very, very badly for Ukraine. And it's the same story everywhere. This is happening because Ukraine has no reserves. Aggressive attrition. You remember we were talking about that a few weeks ago. Aggressive attrition has whittled the Ukrainian army down. Reserves are exhausted. And instead of husbanding reserves and trying to hold on to the important positions and buying themselves more time and coming up with some kind of maybe a diplomatic strategy about what to do, Zelensky and Syrskyi and Budanov and all of the others, they sent what reserves they had on this absolutely crazy venture into Kursk. And Ukrainian soldiers and ultimately Ukraine are paying the price. This is existential. I mean, if events continue along the road that we are looking at in Donbass, we could see a military collapse very soon before the election in the United States in November.
Yeah, so didn't the United States know this? I mean, we are getting reports now that the CIA knew about this plan. This is coming from the New York Times, that the CIA knew of this plan to go into Kursk almost a year in advance, though they claim they didn't know the exact timing of it and the details. NBC News said the same. The United States knew about this well in advance. Once again, they weren't exact on the details. They were kept in the dark as far as how this is all going to play out into Kursk. But we are starting to get some trickle truth from the collective West media admitting that the U.S. knew about this. So didn't the United States know that Ukraine, if they were to go into Kursk and go through with this operation, of which the United States would have to provide some sort of surveillance and information and strategy in this operation? I mean, it's naive to believe that the United States, the collective West, or NATO didn't provide any help to Ukraine. Actually, we know that the UK provided the Challenger 2 tanks. We know this is confirmed as well. So my point in all of this is the West must have known that, okay, we're going to do this Kursk thing. But if we do this Kursk thing, we're going to accelerate the collapse of Donbass. Is this just basically the West actually admitting this is our only chance left to get the nuclear power plant? So if we accelerate the collapse by a month or two, Russia's going to get these cities anyway, so we might as well go for broke and see if this succeeds? I mean, was that the thinking behind this, or is this just incompetence?
Well,
maybe they didn't know that this would accelerate the collapse in Donbass. Though I can't believe that.
No, I mean, one must allow for a certain amount of incompetence. I mean, last year, if you remember, they got Ukraine to launch this massive counteroffensive in Zaporozhye. In those days, by the way, a year ago, it was going to be capturing Crimea. That was going to be the knockout blow. That was going to shock the Russians into negotiations and create a crisis in Moscow and force Putin to step down and all that kind of thing. That didn't work. So it looks as if, starting from sometime last year, when it became clear that that offensive was going to fail, they started coming up with a new plan. And the new plan was to seize the power station. Getting the troops together after all the losses that they've suffered in the summer offensive, training them up to launch this new offensive. It's obviously taken a long time. And in the meantime, as you rightly say, everything else is falling apart all around them. But they now realise that Crimea is out of reach. They cannot possibly take Crimea. But the objective remains the same. Provoke a crisis in Moscow. Bring about the collapse of the Putin government. You can't do it by capturing Crimea. The war everywhere else is being lost. So how are you going to do it? You seize the Kursk nuclear power station and try and blackmail the Russians into some kind of capitulation, create an atmosphere of crisis that might then play into a crisis in Moscow itself. Putin's whole position might at that point start to look shaky, and you might eventually get that regime change that you've been working towards ever since this conflict began. That, I think, was the plan. Now, I don't know to what extent the military in Washington were briefed about this, because I do get the sense that some people in Washington were taken by surprise. But you can see how, the brains, the geniuses in the White House, Sullivan, Lincoln, all of those people, and the people in the intelligence agencies who are not military people in the same way, they might have cobbled up this plan, come up with it, said to themselves, this is our last throw. We've still got this objective to achieve regime change in Moscow. We might as well throw the dice, see if it works. If it doesn't work, well, Ukraine's going to lose, but then realistically it's going to lose anyway. Ukraine has always been a pawn in this game. So, if you're going to sacrifice the pawn, well, so be it.
The strategy from NATO, from the United States, the collective West, has always been a knockout blow. It's always about delivering a knockout blow, where the Russian strategy is the exact opposite.
Correct.
Okay, let's end it there, I guess.
Yeah.
The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch, like the t-shirts that we are wearing today. I will have a link in the description box down below. Real quick, Alexander, do you remember when Zelensky gave a video statement about a week ago, and he said something along the lines of, I really thought about his statement. It remained with me. He said that the operation in Kursk is going really well, and Russian President Putin is going to end his tenure as president the way he started it, with a disaster in Kursk. And he was referencing the Kursk submarine disaster when Putin came into office, and Zelensky was hinting that the Kursk nuclear power plant and all of that was going to be how it ends. And that was this view that Zelensky had of the operation. That to me gave it all away.
Exactly. That tells you what it was all about.
How they think.
The entire war has been about this. It's not been about Donbass. It's not been about Ukraine. It's not been about anything else than who rules in Moscow. This is what this whole thing has been all about. It's been about trying to engineer regime change there. and with uncertainties about what the new administration in Washington might do. And, we're now hearing that whichever side wins, neither candidate is enthusiastic on pursuing this thing. Even, even the Democrat candidate isn't, apparently. You can see the urgency. Try to do it now before it all fails. And of course, if it fails, well, as I said, you've sacrificed Ukraine, but as I said, it's just a pawn in the game. Ultimately, you don't care about that. If you succeed, however, and you bring down that terrible man and his horrible government and all that, and achieve your bigger, greater geopolitical objectives, what a wonderful coup that would be. And, well, it's worth the risk, therefore. Just try it and see what happens.
Incredible. All right, we will end it there. Take care.